Hello, avid listener. This is Dr. John back with the latest episode of the Evolved Caveman podcast. And I am thrilled to have with me here today Sean Harvey. And Sean is CEO and Senior Strategic Advisor of Warrior Compassion Institute, author of Warrior Compassion, Unleashing the Healing Power of Men, a TEDx speaker, which was entitled Compassion Makes the Warrior. He co-founded Project Compassion, a national initiative to deepen compassion in police departments, federal law enforcement, and the military, which now extends to firefighters, paramedics, veterans, and sectors such as defense and energy. Sean's work addresses hate, polarization, and extremism through innovative leadership and engagement strategies. With over 25 years of leadership and organization development experience, Sean's also served on the faculties of Cornell, NYU, and Baruch College, CUNY. Sean, welcome. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we had a fantastic conversation when we first met, and I didn't realize I was going to be having you on the podcast, but the conversation was so compelling that we had to do this.
Yeah, agreed.
So tell me a little bit about the work you're doing in paramilitary organizations, because that was fascinating to me.
Yeah. I think it's I've been in the men's workspace for about 8 years, 8 or 9 years, and I've been in organization development, change management for about 25 years. And probably 26 years now. We're in a new year. Um, and I think just as I've been on this journey, it's the spiritual path that I'm on, it just continues to show me what the next step is. And I just keep following each spiritual breadcrumb. And there's a certain point when I realized when I moved to Washington, D.C., that the only organizations that were showing up were hypermasculine systems. So,
Mm.
athletics, defense, police, military. And so it just really it kind of showed me that these are the places that it's needed. And then bringing men's healing into those organizations. And given that a lot of these systems have men who've either men who hold hate or radicalized ideology have infiltrated, or these cultures kind of support and grow men and who are vulnerable to more of this ideological these ideological radicalized ideas. And so the pieces all kind of came together. And now I'm doing work in these organizations with corporate men's circles or organizational men's circles or men's ERG programs or men as bridge builder programs or adventures as ways to engage men differently and to have men feel like they're included as part of their well-being, their resilience, and their inclusion in the organizations where often they felt excluded by the way these initiatives have been done in the past.
So you talk about men's healing. What does that term look like and mean to you?
So it's really a thing when we started doing our inner work. When I was at Eileen Fisher, I was the head of personal transformation and well-being. And so I was starting to see the power of this work on our employees when they were able to start doing some of the shadow work, limiting beliefs work, looking at their ego, looking at the Enneagram, and just like some of the understanding they have of themselves and why they do what they do, as opposed to just looking at what they do or the behaviors they have, what's underneath. And so being able to me, the healing work is doing the personal transformation work, doing the inner work and healing. I'm starting to understand the shadow, understanding the wounds, and starting to find ways of healing those wounds to come into your truest definition of yourself.
Yeah, I was thinking about this interview today, and I was thinking part of that work also to me lately focuses on shame and
Mhm.
uncovering areas of shame and also kind of attachment wounds.
Mhm.
And I think men skew heavily towards avoidant attachment styles. And I think that when we're avoidant, we can externalize blame. We convince ourselves that we're rational. We disconnect from emotions.
Mhm.
And I think that fits a lot of the work that you and I do with men.
Right.
Um,
I
so
think I
go
think
ahead.
when you add to that the grievance, the grievances that I think are often at the root of some of the ideological um, radicalization, and that the grievances that are misunderstood that are externally looking at externally as opposed to looking within, for their own inner accountability. And so I think I think we're just looking at the kind of the perfect storm.
Yeah, and I think that to me, externalization is a big part of this whole problem.
Right.
Because if you look at anger dynamics, I'm always curious about anger. And when I'm angry at you, I'm externalizing all blame onto you. So if you just stop being such a fill in the blank, I wouldn't be so pissed off.
Right.
But then you add, an avoidant attachment style to that, which adds to that externalization, and then any layers of trauma. And I agree, you've got this perfect storm where people are pretty unaware of what's going on internally and find it far easier, although unconsciously, to just blame the other, whether it's an individual or a group.
Right.
And I think that's part of the dynamic here that is so problematic.
Right. I think just thinking back to some of the examples I've come across. I think there's a shame. I think there's the grievance, and then there's the deep-seated fears.
Mhm.
And I think there's the fears around, especially when I talk to folks who want to be one guy wanted to be the face of the white power movement. And so I said, what's that about? He's like, well, it gives me pride in my identity. So I think that's also the fear of losing relevance and the identity of claiming, like, clinging to an identity that gives that sense of connection to self. And that's
Yeah.
so I think there's those layers as well.
One, and from, the white supremacists that I've worked with in the past, one of the things that really strikes me is the need to belong. And
Mhm.
I've seen a lot of young men that are isolated, depressive, kind of in the room on the internet that go down these rabbit holes that find identity, as you said, with some of these groups
Right.
and finally feel like they belong somewhere. Although I would argue that it's based on hmm, it's based on false beliefs.
Mhm.
It's based on cognitive errors.
Yeah, I often say it's toxic conditioning and faulty teachings,
Hmm.
that are often at play. And that finding that sense of tribal community or tribal belonging.
Yeah, which is
That
a basic human need that we
Right,
all have. I mean, literally comes down to life or death if we look back to tribal times,
right,
that if you weren't part of the tribe, odds are you weren't going to survive.
right.
And so belonging to a group is incredibly important to us on an unconscious level. Um, so tell me about how you get men engaged in this work, because I think that's one of the biggest sticking points for us in men's work is, how do we get men to really look inward and do the work? Because I think it's scary. It's terrifying at some level.
Well, I think there's a stigma around our work. I think there's stigma around personal transformation work in general for men. And that's why I personally have gone the route of organizational systems, because it's a space I know. It's where I've been for the last, over 2 decades. And I often say men will invest in professional development more than they'll invest in personal growth. So if you embed the personal growth aspects into professional development and skill development, and put it into an environment that is voluntary but safe because it's organizational and it's not that they have to do it on their own. But I do think, the flip side of it, um, it's usually through, and the example I give, I created something called Men's Soul Adventures DC when I lived in Washington, DC. And within the first, and I didn't know how it was going to go over. I didn't know if there'd be any interest. In the first 24 hours, 52 guys signed up. Within 3 months, we had 180 guys. And then I just experimented and went to like four other cities. Within 3 days, we were up to 320 guys.
Yeah, it's amazing.
What it told me was, one, we can't really make it a circle. Like, what's going to keep guys like engaged if we're just coming for a circle week after week that can feel like therapy? But if you add an adventure or an outdoor component, that can be powerful.
Hmm.
And you make it interesting and you mix it up, and it's always a new adventure. Um, that men really do want deeper connection, deeper bonding, and I think for a lot of these men, in particular, faith is a big component. Either questions about faith, questions about spirituality, how to relate what their religious teachings and upbringing to real world application and modern day application. And so I think there's a real when we can connect, and when I've often thought about this, what's really driving our yearning is often our soul's yearning, that our soul's yearning is yearning for something our logical mind doesn't understand.
Hmm.
And so that's why we got I believe we got such a great response to the soul adventures. And when I started to really kind of dig in and ask questions, and why a soul adventure as opposed to an adventure, and half where they wanted a third of them said they wanted just a different type of adventure experience. A third wanted, just deeper conversations with men that went to even the more philosophical. And then a third had just practical questions around spirituality, which I started calling practical spirituality for dudes, you know,
Mm.
and that combination, I think it's finding the right combination of what's going to find what in a man's busy schedule, especially in that 30s, early 40s, when they have kids, when they're focused on work, that they're actually going to take the time to go do something and carve that out. What is that going to be if it's not in the workplace? And I think you have to add that level of play, fun, creativity into the mix that's going to make it worth their while. And so I think when we get so consumed on healing and fixing and all of this, it's like it's not necessarily going to resonate. But if you can embed it into cool, fun types of experiences where you have skilled facilitators that can hold the space to really take men into the types of questions that with the right positioning can just open guys up, and they start bonding with each other and going deep.
Yeah, I really like the approach of, kind of incorporating activities or adventures in there, the doing as opposed to
Right.
just the talking, because I think traditionally that's the way men have socialized is side by side, think
Right.
hunting in the tribe versus face to face, eye to eye. And I think the face to face can often make us feel a little bit uncomfortable
Right.
versus being shoulder to shoulder and we're both looking out the same direction at some common goal, and then having conversation as we move towards that common goal,
Right.
whether that's river rafting or hunting or whatever it is.
I think the only place that might be interesting to explore and test this out as well is with barbers, because barbers tend to be able to get that same type of openness for guys.
Hmm.
Um, you know, it's what happens in a barbershop for a lot of men, and maybe because they aren't looking, they're not looking eye to eye.
Hmm.
And
So it's safer if you're not looking eye to eye. I
right,
mean, we've done couples work, Jory and I, where we have people look face to face, eye to eye gazing for 2 minutes. And a lot of people find that really vulnerable and uncomfortable.
right,
And so I think it's kind of, playing to our strengths and moving into the space using those strengths or where we're more comfortable.
right.
Because one of the things I didn't hear in your conversations about what you were going after with the soul adventures is emotion, that emotional level. But I imagine you get to that around the edges.
Hmm.
Is that a goal, or is it more, you want to talk about spiritual, or you want to talk about philosophical or cognitive issues?
I mean, what I've seen is by opening with either the philosophical or the spiritual, that is safe. And then guys started opening up about their relationships and about their kids and about their, what broke their heart. But I think I don't necessarily start with the emotions right out of the gate. I just know
Sure.
I trust that that's gonna that's going to
It's a
show up
byproduct.
with the byproduct. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because I think one of the things that scares most men is vulnerability, is talking about our struggles, our challenges where we're not good.
Right.
And so to find places or find ways to help them to feel safe to self-reveal is critical.
Right.
Because I think one of the things that you've talked about in the past is this idea that we men think that, oh, well, I'm going through this thing. Well, it's only me. And then we minimize it. Oh, it's not that big of a deal. I'll just deal with it on my own.
Right.
And yet there might be 100 million other men going through exactly the same thing,
Right.
whether that's, parenting challenges or relationship issues or ED or, drinking or whatever it is. And the more we can connect over those areas of challenge, I think the closer we are and the more we can heal.
Yeah.
I mean, I've thought about this a lot. Like if I just tell you all my accolades and all the shit on my resume,
Right.
I don't think that makes us any closer. In
Right.
fact, it might make you think, geez, this guy John's a kind of a prick. He's full of himself. Whereas if I tell you, hey, Sean, I just lost vision in my left eye and I'm hoping to get it back. And it's been 6 weeks due to a retinal tear and a bleed. Like that's a little bit more vulnerable. And I would say that that's a better pathway to connection, to authentic connection, is to be vulnerable and to share your areas of struggle and fear and difficulty.
One of the things that I always, whenever I lead a group, I have a no elevator pitch rule. And so I always say, tell us who you are, don't tell us what you do. Or we care
Hmm.
about who you are than what you do. So,
That's going to be challenging, I think, for many.
oh, it is. It is. And so, and it's also powerful when you frame the check-in questions where they can't talk about what they do.
Hmm.
And then
Because
they're
who am
forced,
I other than what
yeah,
I do?
right, exactly. And especially for so many men where that their work is their identity, you know? And so I think, yeah, I think that's a real challenge for um for a lot of men. And then when we are able to just share and break what I like to say the terminal uniqueness, that we're not the only one.
Hmm.
And it's like, oh, now we can bond. And um when we don't just give off all of our accolades.
Yeah.
I agree with
Yeah. And I mean, one of the positive psychology exercises that I love is this idea of the best possible you introduction. And
you.
and so it's the idea of tell me a story of you at your very best,
Mm.
where there's a story arc of you overcoming a challenge. And, I remember doing this in a class I was teaching of psychologists and therapists. And there was a psychologist from Stanford that I think had gotten great grades, was working at Stanford after getting educated at Stanford, like just had a stellar career, but really struggled with what do I say? Whereas everyone else in the group was starting a story, like one guy told a story about his really nasty, contentious divorce and how he really worked on loving kindness and meditation to forgive his ex-wife, and eventually got to this place where he reconciled with the wife enough that he could go over there and help out around the house, even though they stayed divorced.
Right.
So it's this interesting part because I think that the bottom part of that story where you're struggling is really what connects us emotionally. So I like that model.
Yeah, no, that's a great. I mean, I think this is the conversation we're always having in men's work. I'm always how do we get men to be vulnerable? How do we invite men into vulnerability?
Hmm.
And
Or is there another word we can use besides vulnerability?
right,
That's
exactly.
that's something else I've thought about. Like men don't like that word. Like I don't want to be
Well,
fucking vulnerable.
I did it. I actually brought that word in to training at an insurance company that had a very hyper masculine energy to it. And the biggest pushback in that 5 day training was around that word vulnerability. We're
Hmm.
supposed to be vulnerable, you know?
Well, let me ask you this. Do you remember the first time you were significantly vulnerable with others? Because I do. I remember one that I had earlier. In fact, while you're thinking about that, I'll share mine if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
I remember I was doing a radio show back in, Jesus, almost 20 years ago. And I had come out of Cal with a PhD and someone offered me a radio show and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. First of all, I was scared shitless, but I kind of while I sucked in the beginning, I slowly got better over time and got to interview some world-class experts. But I had this realization that I need to share that part of my DNA is depression and part of it's anxiety.
Right.
Because if I can't share it, then who the hell can? And I remember being terrified before I did that, that I was going to get mocked and humiliated. And I went on the air and I shared it, and none of that happened. In fact, there was a lot of support and kindness that I received. But I mean, that was kind of one of the first times that I was publicly vulnerable. And I remember just being really scared to do it. And since then, I've worked on it quite a bit, and now I have pretty much no problem. But it's
Right.
definitely a process.
Yeah. You're taking me back. You're taking me back. Um, and I just got a kitten 2 weeks ago, so that's why you're maybe hearing some of the background noise of,
Oh, okay.
yeah. Um, I remember, I remember when I was in 12 step and I finally got my 90-day trip and finally told my story,
Mm,
told all aspects, the good, the bad, the ugly. And I just saw people crying in the room. And when you hear the feedback after and how it touched them, how they could relate to it. And I think that's when I really got the power of, you know, um, you know, telling our stories, telling our, the good, the bad, the ugly, the real ugly truth.
hmm.
Um, and I think I'd been around long. I think I've always been kind of more open to being vulnerable, but I think being able to be in that conversation, I was able to really see the impact it had on others. And these days, whenever I'm in a group, if I notice the room is staying shallow, then I'll model and just take the room a little
Nice.
deeper with just a different level of vulnerability.
That was my next question. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and then I think, to your other point, when we start racking up the credentials, it becomes really easy to be intimidating. And so I what I was going to say to that other comment was vulnerability makes us human and shows our humanity.
Yep.
And that's the other part, which is not just hearing the story of vulnerability, but also showing our humanity and showing that we're human. And that makes us more relatable. And so I find that in men's work, especially, I try to focus less on my credentials and more on just who I am as a person, and try to be authentic from that place, not from
Yeah.
the place of my calling cards.
Yeah. I mean, I realized that after I got the PhD from Berkeley,
Mm.
and like I did it because I wanted to kind of, I wanted the academic challenge. And I think at the time there was probably a little bit of ego in there as well. And then shortly after I got it, I realized, oh shit, like this can be intimidating to a lot of people. Like I need to start practicing kicking that pedestal out
Right.
and just showing up as a human. And that's one of the reasons I went and got the PhD is I was really curious about the level of emotion. I'm an emotion geek and have been for 30 plus years. And I love that level because, while you and I might have different life experiences, the emotions that you have based on those experiences are quite similar to something I've experienced in the past. And so I can connect with you on that level,
Right.
regardless of differences in our lives.
Right. Yeah. Well, and also the unexpected ways that we can relate,
Hmm.
and I think often, was supposed to be a third generation long haul trucker. So being able to relate to the blue collar guy, to the, corporate guy, um, and being able to, um, yeah, I think it also gives us more versatility to relate to more men, and then
Yeah.
to really see like beyond our work facades, who are we as men, you
Yeah.
know, and being,
When I like your point of kind of having that set of skills in your toolbox to connect to a wide variety of ages, people, demographics. I think that's a huge asset. I remember I was like a trainee. I was an intern as a school psychologist 30 years ago. And I realized like I could go in the midst of one day, I could go from working with a kindergartner who was on the spectrum
Mhm.
to talking to parents who, I was telling them bad news about their child from test results to talking with a professor at Cal. And I was like,
Mhm.
those are three radically different sets of communication skills
Right.
and ways of being. And to learn to flip through those quickly was huge for me,
Right.
just as an example. So let's talk a little bit about white supremacy and how to begin to dismantle that, how to come alongside. How do you begin to, because I you can't challenge those belief structures. If you challenge individuals, they're going to turn away.
Mhm.
How do you begin to go about that?
I think first is understanding the complexity, the
Hmm.
understanding complexity of what it is. I mean, in the experiences I've had, um, my first encounter was with a Purple Heart Army vet who I thought he does some amazing mindfulness work, and I thought we were on the same page. And at a certain point, he just says, "Yo, take a picture of me." When I snap the photo, he flashes the white power symbol in the middle of the photo, and I was like, what was that?" And went to my spiritual guides, and they're like, "Yeah, this is your guy. These are your guys. You're here to bring love to the hate." And so I knew the next time I had a conversation with them, I just kind of brought it in. I was like, working with cops and military, I'm going to meet my fair share of white supremacists, white nationalists. And he got uncomfortably dead silent for like 45 seconds. And I said, "All right, Sean, what's in your toolbox right now? Like, you can't be a progressive, you can't be a social justice warrior, you can't wrong him, but you are a minister, so you can talk Jesus." So I hammered down. I didn't, talk Jesus. I talked the principles and the teachings of Christ through love, compassion, and deeper humanity, and that kept him in the conversation. So I think from that encounter, I started learning the linguistic gymnastics of what's actually going to
Hmm.
for these guys, and then to understand the complexity of their story. And then I think what we like to do is we like to say, all white supremacists, or in this case, where we are today, all MAGA, we put all these guys into a box and say this is
Yeah.
monolith. And I'm like, well, no, these guys are complex human beings that often don't have a way of expressing all their, either tapping into or expressing all their dimensions,
Hmm.
or we don't see their many dimensions. And so the first is I acknowledge, I see them in their humanity. And I also separate out between their humanity and their views, and I know that their views are not their humanity, right? And so then from there, I know that the views that these guys hold often lead to a life of suffering. So as opposed to, I never say I meet guys where they are because I think that can be condescending because I'm coming down from a higher
Hmm.
place. But what I do say is because I know that most men are suffering, and if we look at the statistics, and these guys in particular have some level of suffering that goes unacknowledged. I always say I meet them in their suffering. I listen for their yearning, and I offer hope in the midst of both.
Yeah, I
So
love that.
that's the mindset I hold. And then I just really get curious about their experience. And what I say is when I'm doing this work, my values and beliefs are secondary.
Hmm.
I can put them in my back pocket. So I don't lose them. I don't lose my own integrity in it, but I don't need to lead with it. I don't need to hold them so hard, so safeguarded so that I can really understand their experience. And so I just get curious and I just ask questions from a place of open-hearted, non-judgmental curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things in there you mentioned, which I think are huge. The curiosity and non-judgmentalness
Mhm.
are key because you've got to understand where they're coming from and why they hold the views they hold,
Right, right,
and quite respectfully.
right.
And I remember the first time I did it, it was difficult. It was difficult to put my judgments in my back pocket.
Right.
And you get better at that. And I think it's the only way. One of the exercises that I like that has been shown to reduce racism is the 36 questions exercise, where there's this list of 36 questions and it's broken up into three sections of 12. And you alternate asking each other questions and just listening to the answers, no comment. And what they find in research is that by going through this exercise, you can have, for instance, African American and a white supremacist doing this exercise, and it reduces the racism. And that seems like a relatively simple exercise, but it allows one another, it allows each individual to see the humanity behind the mask.
Well, see, I think you just hit it. We like to make this stuff really complex, and we like to overpackage it. We like to overprocess it. And what I'm finding is often it's the simplest activities or experiences, and just breaking down the isolation, creating the sense of connection, asking questions that go deeper than, like, even subtly deeper than the superficial, can start to open the door.
Hmm.
And when it feels like an invitation as opposed to a mandate, it feels like an invitation as opposed to forced, you know? If it, and I know with working with cops and military, if it doesn't feel political,
Hmm.
right? And so I think there's just certain things that you start learning, like what's gonna trigger and what's not. And like I said, living with my ex-boyfriend who was ultra conservative MAGA, I got to learn like what's gonna land, what's not gonna land, and it kind of opened the door for me to say, okay, how to really do this work. And for me, with him, it was like, how do I love this man even when I hate his views? And I don't hate him, I hate,
It's
his
a
views.
great distinction.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm also trying to do in those situations is over time get at what's underneath the anger. And that's, I've done anger management for many years, right? And it's a question I teach a lot of clients, like what's the secondary emotion? Anger is not always a secondary emotion, but a lot of times there's emotions underneath anger, guilt, shame, sadness, embarrassment, depression, things like that, anxiety even. And so to begin to get at, you know, what are you actually feeling underneath that anger that's fueling the anger?
Right.
And you mentioned irrelevance early on, and I think it's not an emotion, but it is a thought, a fear.
Yeah. I think what I would we would when Jim and I started dating, we would have these rage-filled conversations about politics. Rage-filled. And I said, look, I'm not here to change I don't care what your politics are. I'm not here to change your politics. It's not my job, and it's not my place. But given what I do for a living, you best believe I'm going to call you out and ask you about the anger with which you hold those views. What's beneath that anger? What's that about? And and basically over the course of our 9-month relationship, we went from rage-filled um, political conversations to non-emotional, civil political conversations. And so even if it wasn't shifting anything else, but just like getting us a better sense of creating safety to understand the anger and the emotion involved, I think that was a huge movement. And what I often say then when I'm able to really hold someone around their hate, my question is, all right, so let's talk about the hate. Let's understand what's underneath that, And so I think to your point, the emotions, the anger, the rage, the hate,
Fear.
and then underneath it, the deep-seated fear,
Yeah.
the shame, what's creating the third rail that's going to electrify you if you touch it. What's that about? And so um I always I always look at that's when you're going into some of these conversations, the one of the best ways to engage the conversation is just to do like a process check around what's going on emotionally,
Hmm.
or to just name the emotion that you're seeing and then say, let's just unpack what that's about. And that usually de-escalates in a certain way.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of it also is about creating greater emotional awareness, self-awareness in
Right.
any of us, because I think we all need some teaching there, some
Right.
introspection there?
The one thing there's not a lot of us to do this work. I mean, there's a
Hmm.
lot of us to do men's work these days, but not a lot of us do this work with men in these particular groupings of men. I think you can see it in for a lot of men on the right, you see um evangelical mega churches that can do a men's revival and take 1,000 guys out. Right. So
Hmm.
there's a spiritual aspect to it, or a religious, I should say religious aspect, but you're getting the dogma as well. But to be able to, outside of that context, be able to engage men on the right or the far right or extremists um, in this type of work, I often look at it as a gift that they see me as non-threatening and feel safe opening up. And so I think there's something in that to also explore of what is it about me, you, that if we're able to do this work, that what are we doing to create the level of safety, the level of comfort and feeling like we're non-threatening.
So what would you say is what's behind that for you?
For me, um, I think one, I've done a lot of my own inner work, so I'm not coming with inner turmoil when I approach these guys.
So is another way to say that you have some calmness to you or peace generally?
Calmness, groundedness,
Okay.
peace. Yeah. So I think that's part of it. I think part is I've integrated the masculine and the feminine.
Mm.
And so they don't necessarily understand the feminine, but they're drawn to it, you know? I think I understand. I mean, I have what I call, in this work package privilege, like I can look the part,
Mm.
you know? Um, and, I really demonstrate that I can be curious about their story and
Yeah.
they're going to be judged.
Yeah. Non-judgmentalness. Yeah. I love the idea of balancing the masculine and the feminine. I honestly think that that's the goal for all of us, or a goal for all of
Right,
us, male
right,
or female. I think that, one of the things I talk a lot about is the man box and how we're socialized and the rules that we come to believe about what it means to be a quote unquote real man. And a lot of that is this turning away from and mocking and humiliate or mocking the feminine.
right,
And that's a real problem to me because those are necessary skills and they're part of our humanity.
right,
And we tend to just cut ourselves off from half to two-thirds of our own humanity
right,
and then wonder why we can't connect with someone in relationship, for example.
right.
So tell me, what does that mean to you to balance the masculine and feminine?
Yeah. So, when I write in my book, I kind of just did this era where we start in the wounded masculine. We move to the wounded feminine because we don't know what the hell it is. We heal in the healing feminine and then we strengthen the healing masculine. But the only way we can actually come into our true integration is through the feminine.
Hmm.
Right. And that's what gives us the capacity for emotionality, a more emotional expression, more creative expression, open to compassion, healing our wounds so we can have compassion for ourselves and forgiveness for ourselves. And then that piece around vulnerability, right? That we can be vulnerable with who we are. And so, I think those are and coming in, I think what I see in a lot of men's workspaces is either where we're bringing a hypermasculine approach to beat your emotions out of you, or we're taking a consciousness approach that is demonizing the masculine and elevating the divine feminine. But we're not really there's not as many that are talking about the true integration and to your point, into our humanness or into our humanity.
Hmm.
We can really be balanced and just have a broader array. And I think that's kind of the approach I take in general, which is accepting, whatever man, this is his truth. And then as opposed to wronging that truth, just expanding it by saying, and if we look at it from another perspective, or here's another layer to help you think about this. and just keep adding layers to the equation as to saying, no, this is the, your way is wrong and I have the right way. Because when we talk about belief systems, who's to say that my belief system is better than your belief system?
Right.
Right.
Well, and I really like that idea of bringing the healing feminine in, and I agree because I think what often happens, well, it happened to me in my journey, and I think happens to a lot of men in general, is that we'll start to feel something, a vulnerable feeling, and then we attack ourselves for having that emotion and feel shame about it. And then we get stuck in this negative thought emotion spiral or loop. And the thing that's really damning about shame to me is it's the belief that we are unworthy of love, connection, and belonging.
Right.
So it just serves to further isolate those that are already isolated.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's why in writing the book, it was, you know, men's healing as a catalyst for systems change, but really the sub message was helping men learn to love in a new way, when they can start to learn to love themselves and moving
Hmm.
from the love with conditions they've learned to what does it mean to actually give and take unconditional love.
Yeah. And when receiving love, I find is really difficult for a lot of the men I've worked with.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
again, I think that has to do with worthiness. Do you feel you're worthy of that kind of love?
Yeah.
And I think that's a hurdle for most of us to overcome at some point in this journey.
Yeah.
I know it was for me.
I find the self-worth conversation is probably the most pervasive that comes out of the work. Low
Hmm.
self-worth or trying to achieve someone else's validation, aka
Well,
father.
and so that distinction between internal validation and external validation is huge. And I think it's one of the hallmarks of moving to becoming a mature male is moving from the need for external validation or validation of others saying, "Wow, great job, you got an A," or
Right.
you got this contract signed, to internal validation where you're operating according to your own set of values and you pat yourself on the back when you behave in accordance with those values.
Right.
It's a huge shift to
It's a
your point.
huge shift. And I think, but to understand, like, what have you been chasing all this time? You've been chasing this validation all this time, and what you've internalized is a low self-worth that no one can fill until we start doing some of the work of giving yourself the love, the forgiveness, and the appreciation and the gratitude for what it is you bring to the table.
Yeah, I would add self-compassion to that, which is often very foreign to most men. Being
Right.
being kind to yourself, like, well, I need that inner critic. That's what motivates me. Like, well, maybe it would be helpful to have a second gear that you could shift into at times, just perhaps.
Right.
The research is really good on that point.
Right.
So,
I,
oh, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, good. I was just gonna say when I worked at Eileen Fisher, they sent me to this artist commune for 5 months in Canada to incorporate the arts into
Awesome.
creative facilitation. But one of the things that there are certain things that you just like are stuck etched in your brain, right? And the one was, imagine an orchestra. Now, what role does the inner critic play in that orchestra?
Mm.
And is that inner critic the conductor? Or can you give that inner critic permission to go play in like the bassoon section? And then let someone else, the self-compassion, the gratitude, or something else play the conductor role. And so I think the other part for me in a lot of this work is also using metaphor, creativity, play in the mix, along with outdoor adventure, um, and and artistry and drawing and painting and what have you, as a way to access, and have a doorway in and an access into the inner life that most people are often challenged to go in when it's just a literal sort of
Uh-huh.
who am I? But if you can just get it through their intuition and their creative expression.
I
And
totally agree. I think metaphor and storytelling are key.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Um, there's a couple ways I wanted to go this. One was getting back to self-worth. And
Yeah.
in terms of self-worth, how do you begin to bolster someone's self-worth? Because I agree. I think it's foundational.
I think I mean spiritually I'm often told I'm a seer. And so I just see people as they are.
Hmm.
And so the one thing I do is I can just do a read on someone, and where I'm at is usually look at all the great qualities you bring that you can't see yourself,
Hmm.
you know? And so I think there's an acknowledgement of, even with this kid that wanted to be the face of the white power movement, it said, look, you're like, you're a good-looking guy, you're intelligent, you're a deep thinker, you care about your family, and you're holding on to this idea. But let's talk about where's love playing in your life, right? Where is love? And I make that distinction between the love with conditions versus the unconditional love, the giving and receiving of it. Because I asked him, I said, so what does being the face of the white power movement give you? And he said, well, it gives me pride in my identity. And he said, okay. So, and what do you love? And he couldn't come up with anything, you know.
Yeah.
And I said, here's my take. When you start to fill your coffers with love, the grip that this has on you is going to start to lift. And you're going to see that this moves from an identity you claim to a phase in your life. And he could really hear that for about 3 minutes, and then he
Yeah.
climbed back down. But a seed was
Hmm.
planted. And I
Yep.
think that's another part of it is planting seeds without this expectation that we're going to create masterful transformation. I mean, let's get off the delusion of that. And the flip side of it is to when we can see the positives in these guys, share it with them because they're so used to at this point being told all the ways that they're in the wrong,
Hmm.
what's wrong with them, that when you start to say, and this is what I'm seeing, these are the skills, these are the gifts, this is like your unique, contribution, that has nothing to do with your work.
Yeah, I love the idea of going after love because I absolutely agree. And I think I'll go after love, I'll go after happiness, I'll go after positive emotions. I'll also go after playfulness, which you mentioned earlier, which was one of the other ways, other avenues I wanted to get back to, because one of the questions or series of questions I'll ask men at some point is, where did your playfulness go? Where did your sense of humor go? Where did the
Yeah,
laughter go? Because I think, research shows that we tend to cut ourselves off from sense of humor, laughter, smiling around the age of 23. And I think there's another negative hit around the age of 13, give or take.
right,
And we think we're supposed to be this serious, stoic individual. And I would argue that's not a great way to go through life.
right, right.
And so I can press people on positive emotions. How many can you name? How many can you recognize? How often do you experience them? And, most people, I believe, are shooting for happiness at some level or to be happier. And so you can kind of begin to dovetail some of those ideas in. And I really like the idea of planting seeds. That's my approach as well. I just think of it as I'm just planting seeds of different ideas in their head, and then I just back off.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Well, I'm going back to the play. I think when we create experiences where I often tell facilitators, you're not going to come in with some robust like play experience, but you can start to embed little micro playful experiences that start to like get men in particular to be comfortable with being silly.
Hmm.
It's like often and what I find is, I mean, my whole thing is you don't know you need me until you experience me. And it's like no matter what I describe, that's not necessarily going to uh give you a sense until you've actually experienced it. And I think the same is with play. When we're giving men permission to play, and then we can debrief it after and say, so how was that? And then they realize they want more of it, or you give them a kernel of self-awareness.
Yeah.
Oh man, I want more of this. Like, give me the Enneagram. Like, let me talk about. So I think if we go backwards sometimes as we go head on, like we're gonna do, and they're like, well, screw you. But when you kind of just give them an immersive experience that they can, or even just little bites, so they can start to like realize they can be, because I think one of the big fears for men is, and what the stoicism is, the fear of being ridiculed.
Hmm.
And so when they're not ridiculed, or they can all laugh at each other and go, oh yeah, this is what play can feel like. This is what fun can feel like. then they start to become more balanced human beings.
Yeah, and I think you say fear of being ridiculed. I say fear of embarrassment because I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of stuff we don't do in life for fear of being embarrassed. And I
Yeah.
think, laughter, playfulness, silliness are right up at the top of the list.
Right.
And then I kind of go into, well, but what is embarrassment? Like
Right.
let's break down embarrassment. Like what is it truly? It's, you violate a social norm, you look foolish, your cheeks get red for 30 seconds, and you want to get the hell out of the situation.
Right.
Is that something that you can tolerate? Yes,
Right.
you can. And can we work on that? And can we get more comfortable with being embarrassed and realize that it's not the end of the world?
Right.
Because I've seen that in pretty much every man I've ever worked with over the last 3 decades, a fear of embarrassment, a deep fear.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Hmm.
I really appreciate the work you're doing. I appreciate the time spent in this conversation. I love what you're doing. What did I not ask you that I should have?
Hmm. What are my hopes?
What are your hopes?
What are my hopes? Um, or why do I do this? Why
Yeah,
do I do
why?
this? Why? Um, I think partly it's that I've been called to it, and partly I know I can do it, and I know that I can do it in a way that it's its own unique lane. But there's something about seeing the light bulb go off for these guys that it feels different when it's maybe someone who's like kind of gets it or might be more on the progressive side of the equation.
Hmm.
Um, but when that light bulb goes off, that light bulb goes off, and it's like it can just feel powerful for them.
When you talk about meaningful work, and I don't, that's some of the most meaningful work out there to me.
Yeah, yeah. And the flip side of my metrics are like, how does this work reduce mass shootings, mass casualty events, hate-inspired violence, and suicides? When men go past that point of hopelessness, you know, and they see that they only have two options, take someone else's life or their own life,
Yeah.
and so being able to contribute to that. So my hope is to um really one mature into this work myself. I actually just applied to go through my own version or go through an organization's training on de-radicalization
Mm.
techniques. And so I've been doing a lot of this through intuition and instinct, and doing all right. And so now I'm like, let me start getting some more formal training in this capacity. And it's actually for the, preferences given to residents of the state of Pennsylvania because, Pennsylvania has the third highest rate of hate activity in the country. So I call it the sleeper state. Um,
What are the other two, by the way?
California is number one based on size. Florida's number two, then Pennsylvania, then I believe it's Texas, and then Georgia.
Well, I guess we're in the right states then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, so my hope is to become a contributor and really add value to the community of others who are doing this work, and be a voice for this work, and be able to just support more men in their healing.
Yeah. Amen. And I saw you were on Ashanti Branch's podcast, who's doing some great men's work as well.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, yeah, he's a great man. So let me ask you this: where can people get a hold of you if they would like to find out more about what you do and how you do it?
yeah. I think that the easiest is to go to my website, warriorcompassion.com.
Perfect.
Um, and within there, there's the podcast I've done, been a guest on, and also just more information. And as I start putting out more programming, that'll be the first place to go to learn more.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Sean, for your time. I really appreciate it. And as I said, I appreciate the work you're doing.
All right. Thank you so much. It's great being here.
And that's it for this episode of the Evolved Caveman. Thanks so much for your attention and time. I know it's precious. If you like this episode, be sure to like, rate, review, and most importantly, share. If you didn't like it, you don't have to do a damn thing. Thanks so much. Until next time.